it's Misha Jim Gibney, Tommy O'Wall, Féile and Phobail, Gisparach August discussion group, and a new Tommy Kench, le Mick O'Reilly, Fhuhanya Lower From Lucifer to Lazarus, and A Life on the Left. And I would just like to begin by extending a very warm welcome to you, Mick.
Thank you, Jim.
On behalf of Féile and Phobail.
Okay, I'm delighted to be here.
And we are this year, due to the extraordinary circumstances of the pandemic, we're going virtual again.
Right.
But the good thing about that is that last year we had 3 times as many people watched as would normally do in a real set.
That's incredible.
So you're going to be speaking to lots of people about your life and times.
Okay, fine.
And particularly your life and times as a leading trade union figure in the Irish trade union movement. And I think you spent some time in the British trade union movement as well. But by way of an introduction, what I would like to say to you is that in the book, in the acknowledgement section of the book, you recognise, rightly so, your wife Mary. And if I can just get that here. You acknowledge and dedicate the book to your wife Mary and to your daughters Louise and Suzanne, your grandchildren and your great-grandson. And of course, as well, you had a daughter, Emma.
I had indeed. Yeah.
And she lived for 4
days.
For 4 days as well. But what was interesting in the acknowledgement section of the book was a comment that you were gratified with from Helena Sheen. And she said, it's not an iBook. It's not an iBook.
Yeah.
And I think that kind of like would sum the book up for me, that this really is it's an autobiographical book, but it's really a life story of involvement in the trade union movement. And the trade union movement is to the fore in this story. And your life is in a sense, at the backdrop to the story. The foreground is the trade union movement. The background is your life story. And it spans a period of almost 50 years of activism. And it takes us through some remarkable changes from the days when the Soviet Union was a counterpower to the US.
Yes.
And a time whenever the trade union movement was powerful and made governments and broke governments and was a tremendous asset in terms of change in society. So in the book, you also are a great friend and admirer of Paddy Carmody. And he gave you good advice in relation to communism and in relation to being critical of the Soviet Union. But you also make it clear in the book yourself that you're not half a communist. You're a full communist, and that you always had an independent streak in you about your communist outlook. So how do you reconcile the two things? An independent communist and critical of the Soviet Union at the same time?
Well, what I try to do is to express the fact that if you want to change this world, you have to build organizations. And if you build organizations, you have to build discipline in them. If you're not disciplined, if you're not able to combine with others, you will not be successful, to put it mildly. That's one of the great failures of the whole European left, let alone the Irish left. So it's important to understand that discipline has to be based. You can decide that things that are important to you if they're only important to you, sometimes you have to give them a backseat while others pursue. If the broader movement wants to pursue something bigger, then sometimes you have to, go along with the broader movement. But it's important to always keep your own ideas and your own identity and do your own thinking. Nobody should think for you. Nobody should tell you what to think. I was mightily impressed by a simple statement from Bertolt Brecht, a great communist playwright and a poet, who said, "If you're hungry, read a book. It's a weapon." I left school at 12 years of age, and the only good thing happened to me in school was the fact that I learned to read and write. Not very well, but I learned to read and write. And I read and read. Now, sometimes I read in all kinds of direction because I had nobody to direct me. And when I was first interested in the ideas of socialism, and I'm not sure where they came from because I don't come from a political family. My father and mother were both from the Liberties of Dublin. She was from Brabazon Row, and he was from High Street. There's not maybe a half a mile between the two streets. They were rare there. My father joined the British Army in 1918. Now, I think if you join, I'm not in favour of people joining the British Army, but if you're going to join it after a big conflict where loads of people have been killed and you're likely to get a few years of peace. He joined the British Army at 14 years of age. Yeah. I thought that was unusual, but I've subsequently looked into it. And the army was full of children. Yeah. The British Army was full of children, particularly in the First World War. And he joined it after there and was sent to India, like thousands of people from the slums of Dublin. Yeah. And this was in the middle of one of the wealthiest empires on earth.
And in the book, in the early days of growing up in Cork, you describe your family life as almost a comfortable life. Although you describe one night that your father brought home a gun because there were rats.
Yeah, it was a pellet gun. It was a pellet gun, and it wasn't in Cork. It was in Cork Street.
Okay,
it was Cork Street in Dublin. It was right in the middle of the Liberties. I should say that just to give people a picture of the Liberties of Dublin. The Liberties of Dublin is a very fascinating place. My mother used to say, "You should never move out of Cork Street because all the wonders of the world and all the things you could ever know will happen to you in Cork Street." Well, I moved from Cork Street, but nevertheless, there was a grain of truth in what she said, in the sense that all drama was there.
Yes.
You've only to read Sean O'Casey's plays, or read his autobiography, which deal with these kind of people that I grew up with. And we lived in one room in a tenement house in Cork Street beside Morelli's fish and chip shop. And the point of the Liberties was it was a very famous place because it had one of the most famous industries in the world in it, Guinness's brewery. Mm-hmm. It also had a synagogue, which was quite unusual, and it had every dimension of Protestant church in it. So it was quite an internationalist place in a way. And I remember as a child being fascinated with the Jews on Saturday with their farm, with their gear, we'll call it, going. And it always fascinated me that how people just by tradition worship God in different ways. Yeah. And my grandmother lived in Maryland, which is just up the road. And my uncles and that. So my mother came from a very big family. She was the eldest. She was born in 1904, and she was the eldest of a family of 15 people. Yeah.
And in terms of family life, because I thought this little cameo of describing your father shooting the rats. Yes. And those circumstances were children. And what also happened to you in relation to your father dropped dead.
Yes.
In front of you.
He did, yeah.
And you were only 7 years of age.
Yeah.
You left school when you were 11, as you said.
Yeah, I was 12 actually. But
12.
Yeah.
And your mother died when you were 16.
Yeah.
And that in 1968 you met Mary and you were married in 1972.
That's correct, yeah.
And so tell me, in terms of these family tragedies, I feel like, so early, what influence did they have on your life in terms of the direction it took? I mean, what did you do not going to school?
That's a kind of a long story. What happened was, after my father died, I was ill. I think I had a nervous breakdown, but people didn't have nervous breakdowns in Ballyfermot in the 1950s. The word wasn't invented for us. Yeah. I was just off sick. I wasn't well, and I had an abscess in my ear. And they used to do a thing called the drill display, which was you do movements to a band. And the whole school got out. Now, the school I went to, the De La Salle School, which was a real cram shop in Ballyfermot, there was about 53 or 4 kids in a class. And I remember that because I was 49th in the exam. I never forgot that. And there was a photograph of us all. So you didn't learn anything in school. The teachers barely kept order. They were all Christian brothers, mainly Christian brothers, a few masters. And they were fairly brutal to the kids. You know, I mean, they'd give you a wallop, they'd hit you quicker than they'd look at you. And it was full of kind of religious teaching and Irish, very narrow-minded kind of form of Irish nationalism hung over the whole place. And to be honest, I detested school. I really didn't like it. But reading and writing, I liked. History, I liked. And I could read. And I remember as a kid reading Tom Sawyer and Huckleberry Finn and all those kind of things as a child. But when I went back to the school, I couldn't do the drill display. I just wasn't with the tempo because they'd all been training for it. I wasn't. About 2 or 3 kids couldn't do it. So you were sent up the top of the class to kind of look at them. Anyway, the head brother came out. And now I want to make this clear. He did not, and he wasn't inflicting any pain on me. He just twisted me ear to say, "What are you up here for?" But I had an abscess in my ear, and the pain was excruciating. So I headbutted him, and I run out of the school, and I never went back to school after that. I never went back to school.
So
and it was a dreadful thing to do. I mean, I regret it to this day, but I didn't go back to school, and I just kind of hung around, and I got work. I got work in a place called Howard's, which was making coats. It was up the top of Capel Street, and I was a Hoffman presser.
Where does the notion of this awareness of, I think there's a reference in the book to what I call the Crombie coat incident.
The Crombie coat incident. Well, that was my communion. It's the only time I can remember the whole family going out. And my mother brought me a blue serge suit and a fawn Crombie overcoat in Francis Street Market. It would be second hand, but it was a really good coat, really posh looking. You know, it was as good a coat as you could ever see in Ballyfermot. Anyway, the point was, I remember it because we all went to the Tivoli cinema. And we went to see The Harder They Fall with Humphrey Bogart. I remember the film. We went to Johnny Ray's after it for tea and ice cream. And I remember my sister being delighted because you got three wafers with the ice cream rather than 2. So it was really upmarket. The whole family went out. Now, that was so rare for us as a family. It just didn't happen. Anyway, we went out and I got the Crombie coat. The next day I was making my communion. So you walked from where we lived in Ballyfermot down to the school, which was about a mile away. And then the mothers and fathers went up to the church and they watched the kids walking up from the school. That's why it was done. You wore your lapel, the rosette. Yeah. Anyway, I put on the overcoat and I went with the kid next door walking down to the school. 2 of us walking together. We're in the same class. And I have no words for this. For where it came from, I do not know. I think it comes from your heart, actually, when you get feelings. But I felt a terrible awfulness come over me. That I was divided from this young fella, who was my mate. And he had no coat and I had a coat. So I took the coat off and stuck it under the privet in the corner of Thomond Road. I can remember it quite. And I didn't think beyond getting the coat off and being his mate. Of course, sometimes you should try and think a couple of steps ahead. Because when I saw my mother's face, I was walking up with the kids. Jesus Christ, I thought, what is going to happen? She'll kill me. Anyway, I told her. But the thing I remember is I told her I took off the coat and put it under the privet and I'd get the coat. She said, you better. But I couldn't explain to her why I done what I done.
So there was this sense of concern about your friend in terms of his...
Yeah.
You had a coat, he didn't have a coat too.
Correct.
There was a concern on your behalf. So is that your very first early sign of a social conscience, would you say?
I don't know what it is. I think
you were concerned about someone else.
Well, what I say in the book is I think children have this by instinct. I hope they have. I think most of them have. And I think life tends to knock it out.
Yeah.
And I think in that sense, if you want to shape a world, you should try and shape a world that knocks less of that out, children. I think that's the message of the coat, if you like.
Sure, yeah. And so at what point in these years, you're 12 or to 14 years of age, do you start to think about joining the trade union movement? Where does that come out?
I never thought about joining the trade union movement. I just went into a factory and said, you have to join the union, kid.
Right.
That was that. So there was no, I mean, in Dublin, you just were told you joined the union. My mother was mad about the union. She was in the Women Workers Union, which was set up by Jim Larkin. And I mean, she wasn't a thoughtful person about the trade unionism. She was a trade unionist by instinct, right? She knew. She wasn't born with a silver spoon in her mouth. She knew that she had to stand with the people she worked with to protect herself and look after herself. My father was the same. I have his union card from the building site he worked on. So that was everywhere in Dublin. In fact, I have a memory of an aunt of mine gave me a 3-penny bar of chocolate in O'Connell Street. And I took the paper off it and I put it into a receptacle. And she said to me, "Don't be doing that. You're doing the corporation men's work." Now that is a kind of, you would say, it's a false kind of consciousness in some ways, but it's a trade union consciousness. You don't do anybody else's work. These people are dependent on this. This is how they work. And I would say that was the residue of Larkinism in the city of Dublin. It was everywhere. It was profound. People didn't think about it. And these people wouldn't say to you, "Oh, this is what Larkin said." They would just do it. It was their instinct.
So it was part and parcel of growing up and working life then.
Absolutely.
Yeah.
Absolutely.
And in terms of Dublin then, but in terms of wider society, the trade union movement was a very strong movement.
Yes.
For workers at this time.
Well, it's just an example. Now my parents had to. I was born in the Coombe Hospital, but I was reared in a tenement for the first 3 or 4 years of my life. But my parents lost a house in Crumlin, where my sisters were born. And I'm just looking back on it now. It must have been a terrible thing for my mother to lose a house because it was a flat rent. And Jim Larkin campaigned for a system of rent based on what he called a differential rent system, which was that you got a house according to your needs, the number of children you had, etc. And you paid for it according to your means. Now, if you think about that, that's a direct quote from Karl Marx, and that was practiced in the city of Dublin. Not in Moscow, not in Peking, not in Cuba, in the city of Dublin, because he had that influence over it. By the way, people used to give out stink about it because they'd want the overtime shouldn't be taken account of and so on and so forth. But the idea that you got a house on your social needs and you paid for it by your ability, I think that's a really good idea. I think the Republican movement in Dublin should look at it again because we still have a huge housing crisis, and it's an idea I think has come back, if I might say so.
The book, there are just too many strikes to make reference to in the book. There's practically a strike every other 4 or 5 pages, or you're either organising a strike or you're in some negotiation around wages and working conditions. So where do you begin to climb the ladder of in terms of the trade union movement? And when do you become an official of the movement?
I became an official in 1978, but I was active in the trade. I was on the executive as a rank and file person and on the branch committee from 1969. But the point about my activity in the union is that I was political before I was a trade unionist. I mean,
you remember the Communist Party?
No, I wasn't a member of the Communist Party. I was interested in socialist politics before I was interested in trade unionism.
Okay.
In fact, I remember, it's in the book, I remember the night that Stalin died.
Okay.
It was on the BBC programme, a fella called Hanrahan done it from Moscow. And he was talking about the people in the streets wailing and crying their eyes out for the loss of the great leader, Joseph Stalin. And my mother was chirpy about it. She thought it was the greatest thing since fried bread, on the basis that there'd be more religious freedom in the Soviet Union.
Yeah.
And my father, now I wouldn't say my father disagreed with that, but he was unhappy about the criticism of Stalin. And now I'm attributing this to him. He did not say this to me, but I think I'm fairly sure about this. I think any British soldier who started the war when Great Britain declared war on Nazi Germany over the invasion of Poland on their own, well, with France to begin with, but France didn't last long. I think after they heard the news of the Battle of Stalingrad, this world believed that the Nazis were invincible, but they weren't. The people of the Soviet Union stopped them in their tracks and chased them back to Moscow. And I always say to my kids, I say to everybody, when the Red Army and the British Army and the Americans entered Berlin, the people that they freed were the Germans. They freed the Germans from tyranny. For Nazism was a real tyranny in terms of its impact on the world. Because there may have been anti-Semitism before. There may have been anti-Semitism always in the world. It is the longest kind of sectarian battle probably in the whole of Europe, the attitude to the Jews. But the Nazis brought it murder on a mass scale by the creation of an industrial complex that mass murdered a people who could do nothing about what their views were. Because if I was going to kill you because you were a communist, I could disbelieve in communism. I could give it up. But under the Nuremberg laws, there was nothing you could do about being a Jew.
You say in the book that the collapse of communism in 1989 is the most profound thing that's happened globally in your lifetime?
Yes.
How do you defend that?
The difficulty, if you look at the history, Eric Hobsbawm says that the history of the 20th century, it started in 1917. It was about the Soviet Union and it ended in 1989. And there's no doubt about it that the Soviet Union was the centerpiece of every conflict on earth. People look to it for guidance, people look to it for inspiration. And particularly, not so much, I don't think so much in Western Europe, but certainly in Latin America, in India, in Asia, in Africa, where people really have a much rougher time than we have. I think they looked at the Soviet Union much more as a model that could help them get out of the state that they were in by the colonial powers. And the point is this.
Struggles.
Yes, but the point is that you see, the Soviet Union was a beacon of hope. The Soviet Union was a way you could do other things. And the other thing the Soviet Union was, the Soviet Union put a certain amount of manners on the Americans and the British. They weren't able to do what they liked. Now, the Soviet Union may have been dreadful for the people of the Soviet Union, and I'm not saying they had to put up with that because they put manners on the imperial power, because it is a fact, and some of my comrades in the communist movement don't like me saying so. It is a fact that the Russians could produce superb weaponry because they were in competition. But if you look at the white goods in Russia, If you look at washing machines and televisions and the things that the ordinary Soviet people depended on and needed, they were very, very badly done.
Yeah. Because
there was, I think, insufficient democracy to argue about the way socialism developed in the Soviet Union. And there are a multitude of reasons for this. The Soviet Union was isolated, the Soviet Union was invaded by 14 countries, the Soviet Union was attacked by the fascists, they lost 27 million in the war, their country was destroyed, they didn't get any Marshall aid, they didn't get anything. But they built themselves up, and they were a very formidable force. So I would have liked to see Gorbachev's dream of a reformed Soviet Union, which would have had more democracy, which would have listened more to the people, etc., etc. But that was not to be. It was crushed, and whatever emerged from it, whatever it is now, I don't know what it is now.
Sure.
It's just another capitalist country, actually, which has a tendency to be autocratic.
I just want to talk to you about, so you were saying earlier that you had your own socialist politics.
Yes.
Before you became an official in the trade union movement.
Yeah.
And then what was your day-to-day experience then when you become, in terms of organising workers and organising the union? And
well, first of all, I worked. I had a variety of jobs, of course, but I left. I worked in Lincoln and Nolans. This is kind of an important thing in terms of my development. I started working at a place called Lincoln and Nolans, which would have had about 600 or 700 workers. They were assembling cars, British Leyland cars. And I started on the 21st of October 1962. I was interviewed for a job at 1:30 of the day. I had a variety of jobs, but this was the first time I was ever told to go and see the shop steward. The shop steward's name was Billy Wheatley. And at that time in the factory, they used to say the rosary at 1:30. And now in a factory of, say, 400 or 500 people, probably about 7 or 8 people said a rosary. And Wheatley said to me, and, forgive me, but I'm quoting somebody else, so I will use bad language to convey the authenticity of what he said. He said, them fuckers are down there praying for overtime, kid, but you don't mind them. Join the union, I'll get you time and a half for it. And that went into my head. That went into my computer. Because what was he saying there? He was saying, you don't resolve or make the world better by prayer. You make the world better by human activity and by creating solidarity. And that's the only way you can stand up to a boss. If you want a pay rise, don't say a prayer. Organise. And he made a huge impact on me. And Billy used to bring me in books. I remember him bringing me in a book on Bernard Shaw. Now, he had served in the British Army. He was active in the Labour Party at the time. He was a very interesting man. He had a big family. But he actually said to me when I was about 17, before I left Lincoln Lawrence, he said to me, "You will be the leader of the union one day." Now, I would just observe. I had a great difficulty in speaking in those days, and I would observe the people at the meetings. And I remember going to my first union meeting. I must have been 16. We used to have quarterly meetings. I was in a union called the National Union of Vehicle Builders. And I went to the meeting. There'd be hundreds of people would go to the meetings in those days. Top table full of people. All the men would wear their Sunday suits, and they were all men. There was no women worked in the car industry, and they would start speaking, articulating arguments about the weight of inflation, the profitability of the companies, all these kind of things. And these people I worked with impressed me no end. Ordinary people. But they had the seeds of change in them. And they weren't mad about strikes. Strike would be the last thing they wanted to do. And I learned a style of negotiation, which I would say to be rock solid. And you have to let the other side know that you will strike if you have to. But that's not what you want to do. You want to find a solution. But if they think you're trying to avoid a strike, then God help you. You'll come out with nothing. You'll come out with nothing. Employers respond to power. Industrial relations are about power. Organisation is about power. It's about creating a countervailing power to the power of capital. right, which left to its own devices is not a very humanistic way of running the world.
And how strong were the trade unions in Ireland?
They were very strong, particularly where I worked. I mean, there would be things vary, but about 50% of the private sector was organised then, including building workers. It was very hard to organise because they're a kind of itinerant workforce, you know, and they organised building workers and did a very good job. One of the few trade union places in Europe, actually, where building workers had pensions and all sorts of sick scheme and a whole thing like that. Because it's very difficult to organise a whole industry, which is full of small employers. But they were able to do that in Dublin. And I remember the building strike in '64. Huge building strike, and the unions won the strike hands down. So I was following union affairs, and I was reading socialist literature, and I had no place to go for an education. So I went to the Catholic Workers' College, which was run by the Jesuits, and I got a diploma off them actually for my attendance at the.
I want to just read this extract from the book on page 85, because when I was reading this, I was thinking of your family, and just let me read this and see what you think of it. It's about how busy you are in your trade union work. On Monday night, I'd have the political committee. On Tuesday night, a union meeting. On Wednesday night, a lecture. Thursday night off, but Friday night selling the paper, to say nothing of meetings at the weekend in Belfast or elsewhere. How do you fit in the life of a branch on top of that? It was hectic, and I was also working 5 days a week in a car factory.
Yeah.
You know? So where is your time for your family with a lifestyle as hectic as that? And working in the interests of others, other workers in factories up and down the country?
Well, I hope this is true. I'm going to say it. It's for others to decide whether it's true or not, because maybe my family will look at this. It might not be that I gave them the length of time that they should have had, but I hope that the quantity of time I gave them had quality in it, because I always tried to make that happen. Whether it succeeded or not is not for me to judge. It's for them to judge. That's the only way I could try and make up for that. Because I also tried with my children and everybody around me. I have always tried to make everybody conscious of the world and enjoy the world. Because one of the things that I learned through Marxism was the joy of culture and ideas and reading and all, music and all of those things that make for an interesting life. Because life should be permanently examined to find out what it's about. And if you have a lucky life, by the end of it, you may have figured yourself out.
Mm-hmm. So I think that the scale of busyness that's reflected in the book brings the strength out of the trade union movement itself. And you said yourself when you went into your first job, one of the first things that they said to you was you were to join the union,
yeah.
in the workforce.
Yeah.
And there was from that a sense of strength and a sense of security.
Yeah.
And as well as that, a sense of confidence that in terms of your workplace and security.
Yes.
And what's your take today on the current state of trade unionism in Ireland? And that experience that you had, is that typical of experience of working people today?
No, I would say the trade union movement is much weaker, actually, today. Part of this is new technology. I mean, we have thousands of people are employed. They don't even know who their employer is. They work for an algorithm. They're on the streets there and they're told to pick up this, pick up that, or pick up the other. But I liken that to the situation Larkin found in Dublin in the early part of the century, where people stood outside the docks and you were called and you weren't, and I was looked after and you weren't looked after. And they were the flotsam and jetsam of life. They had no rights. And the only people that can give them rights are themselves. The trade union movement can help them, but bureaucracies themselves are not great at organising. Workers themselves have to learn the skill of organising. I want to say just one thing that I think is the most important thing about trade unionism. Trade unionism is not a thing you join and it does things for you. Trade unionism is about you joining and you working it for you. Right? In other words, a trade union is not a consumerist experience, right? And it's got into our culture that a trade union is a consumerist experience, like the Yellow Pages. We'll get a solicitor to do it rather than a trade union. The point about trade unionism is it is the collective endeavours of the men and women who you work with who want to change this place and shape it, right? And make it more human from their perspective. That's what trade unionism is. That's what's important about trade unionism, not the idea that the union official knows everything and does magic for you and changes your situation. You're the only one that can change the situation. Workers are the one power on this earth that can still change the world, and nobody has invented anything that can make this world run without workers. Mm-hmm. I don't care who they are.
But in terms of being a combination,
yes,
of and an area where people come together to protect their jobs and their way of life, the trade union movement today, in your view, is still as pertinent as it was when you were a young man?
No, I don't think it's as pertinent. I think it should be, but I don't think it is, because there are things that have happened to the trade union movement. I was always opposed in the trade union movement, and again, some of my friends in the trade union movement give out about me for this. I am opposed to what I would call the centralised bargaining that took place in the South for 20 odd years, where trade unions underpin the kind of programme of pretty right of centre governments, including, let it be said, although it's hurtful, I suppose, for the trade union movement to hear it, they propped up governments even with the progressive Democrats in them. Now, I don't think that's right. I'm not saying they shouldn't recognise the fact that the progressive Democrats are in the government or they have to adjust the things the Social Democrats do, but to actually have a joint programme with the Social Democrats, that for me was a bridge too far. And I was very, very critical of that. But what happened in those years was things were done for the movement by a centralising committee, and the wage increases came down, and you had a vote every 2 or 3 years on whatever the form of the agreement was. So you weren't really involved in it that much. You just looked at the thing 3 years. And I remember regularly people would say to you, "Oh, Mick, what are you going to do for us? The government gave us this." Because people had in their heads the idea that, and the point is this: you have to be active yourself. If you don't engage in activity, okay, we're working for this fella, Johnny Blogs, and we're making widgets. And the widgets have gone up and he's making more money. So we have to sit down, we discuss what we're going to get, we negotiate with him, we make a judgment on it. Maybe we'll accept it, maybe we won't, maybe we'll go to Labour Court, maybe we'll have a strike or whatever. But we'll do it. We exercise our judgment. We exercise our power. We exercise our intellect. We exercise the whole movement. Now, if you don't do that for 20 or 25 years, all those muscles atrophy because they ain't doing nothing. You have thousands of shop stewards, and what are they doing? They're waiting for somebody else to do something for them to send it down on the conveyor belt. And hey, presto, somebody gives you a whack, and you don't have national agreements anymore. So the employers don't want to talk to you. Employers are simple people. Most of them would skin a grape. But the truth of it is, as far as they're concerned, when the economy is doing well, they want wage restraint. When the economy is doing badly, they want wage restraint. And the one thing they always want is wage restraints. Right? They don't. No, in all my years, no employer ever picked up the phone and said, Mick, I have an idea. I'd like to give your members an increase. That doesn't happen. You have to be organised to get it. And employers were very happy with the wage agreements. But now the trade union movement is weak enough, they've abandoned them, right? Because they can do better without them.
And whenever you joined the trade union movement, and particularly in the stronger times, it was free collective bargaining.
Yes.
Was the approach. Just explain that to people looking in on this.
Well, the concept of free collective bargaining is just as I said. It's a factory by factory thing, or maybe an industry-wise thing. But the point is, it has a collective involvement and engagement with shop stewards and activists that are very important to the trade union movement. It's not done just by the officials. I mean, I wouldn't negotiate a wage increase for car workers based on what I thought. I'd bring in the car workers. Right? They're the most important people because they're working the agreement. They're doing the things, and we lost that involvement of the participation of the people. Now there are some places where this might have worked. It might have worked in the Scandinavian countries where everybody is in the union and where, if you like, the employer and the government are a socialistic kind of government, and they will do a deal with you and you can redistribute wealth and do all the various things like that. But it doesn't work if you're in a society, and I think it has hampered the development of what I call progressive politics in the trade union movement, because Fianna Fáil and Fine Gael were always able to say, well, look, we have the trade union support. They support this wage agreement, or they support this particular redistribution of wealth, or they support this particular form of taxation. Now, the left in Ireland have ideas about levels of taxation, building houses, all those kind of things. But they can be delivered not by a trade union movement, but they can be delivered by a left of centre government. But the only way that's going to come about is if the trade union movement is behind that kind of process. And frankly speaking, up to this, they have not been. They have been propping up right-wing governments in the form of national wage agreements for a period of 25 years. And it will take a while to get over that. But I have complete and absolute faith in the resilience of ordinary folks to get on top of this, to deal with problems that beset them and to organise themselves. That they have to organise differently than we organise. There are different industries, a different tempo to life, a different situation. But they have to organise, because if they don't, guess what? Nobody's going to look after them. They've got to look after themselves.
You mentioned earlier on about the male-dominated movement that, in terms of the trade union movement and its leadership, and you also mention feminism in the book, and you also make reference to the whole question of gender pay equality and issues of that nature. So where is that sitting in terms of trade unionism?
Well, the trade union movement, had to be kicked, screaming and dragging by the feminists in the trade union movement into taking up some of the issues. I remember we a place called Packard Electric, which is a big female membership. Very, very difficult work. They made parts for cars and all the rest of it. And we would meet always on Sunday morning. And there used to be a group of women up the front who I used to call the knitters, because they would remind you of the guillotine. Anyway, you'd go in there and say you'd be a week in negotiations with the company. And you'd give a report on the outcome of those negotiations, which might last a half an hour. And the first question would be, you've reported to us about a half an hour, but you were a week with the company. What are you holding back? Now you can't, there's no answer to a question like that. So I found when I started as a trade union officer, I had no experience of working with women. And I took the second biggest equal pay claim in a place called Echo in Dundalk. And I found that women were far less macho, far more commonsensical. But once they got their teeth into something, God help the employer. because they certainly made me bring back the bacon for them. And I just found that period of people pretty good. And there's a lot of people in the trade union movement, not them all, but a lot of people in the trade union movement understood this. I mean, one of my mentors, Matty Merrigan, was way ahead of his time in relation to the far-sided policies that he had in relation to the women workers in Jacobs and because a lot of women worked in the sugar confectionery industry where he represented people. And he eroded, he didn't get equal pay, but he eroded it from the 1950s onward by attacking it all the time. And sometimes male, I remember a group of male members in Echo in Dundalk, I got women equal pay. And they came into me, about 12 of them, they came into me and said, we're leaving the union. And I said, why? They said, well, we want our differential back. And I said, but they were underpaying the women. It's not your differential over them. They were shortchanging them for years. And they said, oh, no, we do male work. And I said, we better go somewhere else. Because I'm not dealing with you. And they tried to join the Irish Transport. In fairness, in the end, the Irish Transport didn't take them because you can't take people for wrong reasons into a union. So I just give that as a small illustration. Now, the point is, there were hundreds of men worked in Echo, and most of them understood the idea that it was better if we paid women. Got women. But there were, there's no point in denying it. There were backward attitudes in society towards this. But hey, you have to fight these things in the same way that in Britain, I remember, trade union officials standing up to racism in some of the factories I worked in. It would be subtle, but it was there. It was there. And they done a relatively good job in the sense of, the situation they had to face. So trade unions have always, in the broadest sense, been on the side of the angels, on the side of equal pay, on the side of shorter working hours, on the side of better holidays, on the side of sick pay, and on the side of a fairer society. So a world without trade unions would be a much worse place. Remember, at the beginning of the 20th century, people worked 80 hours a week. Yeah. At the end of the 20th century, most people in Western Europe worked 35 hours. That's a big achievement. It's
also very clear in the book that you're a United Islander, and that national view of Ireland has a very strong presence in the book. But it's also clear that you have a Marxist view in terms of that, in terms of the James Connolly view of a national democracy.
Yes.
And there's also mention in the book of during the hunger strike period, the strikes that were organised in Dundalk and places like that. And so what's your vision now at this point in time where there is this huge debate taking place about the constitutional future of Ireland in terms of reunification? What would you like to see?
Well, I was in an organisation in the 1980s called the Trade Union Committee for a United and Independent Ireland. And I still believe in an independent and united Ireland. I'm totally for that. In fact, I believe in socialism, though that's probably more complex now in how you would bring that about. What I think is the situation that we find ourselves in now, I think it's very important that all of us who believe in this, start opening up a pragmatic dialogue with the unionist people. And also, I think we also have a responsibility to speak to the trade union movement and the left in Britain about this. Because there's a lot of talk about Brexit. But the thing about Brexit that a lot of people don't speak about is that in this part of Ireland, Britain doesn't organise its absolute control. Mm-hmm. It has to moderate that control because of the negotiations it's done with the European Union. And we would be better saying to British progressive opinion, if you want to have a real Brexit, leave Ireland entirely. Now, I know that harking back to an old kind of debate where you put the emphasis on that rather than... But it's no harm that from time to time that's said to the British trade union movement and progressive opinion. Because unlike most people in Ireland, I support a British exit from the European Union. I think it's a wholly good thing. And I can trace that back to a time when I went to Coventry First. I remember going to a lecture, and it was given by a man called Idris Cox, who was a miner and what we used to call a theoretician, which means a fella does a lot of thinking. Anyway, this guy said to us, the Irish lads, he said, up the back of the hall, yous have to learn, he said, that there'll be never peace in Ireland until there's a republic in England. And I put that into my thinking cap. Yeah. And it's never left me, the idea of the English people being radical, because they do have a radical streak. They were actually one of the first republics in Europe. You know, they were the first people to cut the king's head off, etc. Mr. Cromwell and all the rest of it. And there's a lot I think we could learn from that. We could remind them of their own history from time to time, because people in this part of Ireland, some of them think they are, and talk to them as British, but they leave out a whole section of what Britishness is. And that's a very interesting question, I think, that we should have as part of this whole process of what is Britishness. You know, what does it do? Stand for? What's its culture? Is it democratic? Can it be democratic? All these kind of things, you know, flow from British history. And of course, the people up here in this part of Ulster are loyal to the compromise of 1688 rather than the revolution of 1640. I would have no problem identifying with the revolution in England in 1640 and the Cromwellian republic. So you know, it's. I'm still a united Ireland. I still believe in that, and I still believe in an independent Ireland. Now I know that if you're in the leadership of the Republican movement, if you sort of talk about the EU in a certain way, it can lead you to being isolated. And I would contrast it this way: Fine Gael are in favour of joining NATO, but they never say so. They never talk about it. But if you read their fundamental documents, they're in favour of joining NATO. Now, I think the Republican movement, and I think they still have, should keep the idea of an independent Ireland somewhere there. It's the most important thing that you can affirm. Judging when you put your shoulder to the wheel on it and how you do it is a different matter. That's a tactical thing of measured in politics and all the rest of it. But in terms of a value, I don't think that should be ever abandoned. I think it's most important.
The title of the book, it's very striking.
Right.
It's very striking indeed. And I know there's a story behind it.
Yes.
From Lucifer to Lazarus.
Yes.
So I think it would be, if you could just speak to us about the title and what happened to you, because I know it was a very sad period in your life in terms of your trade union activism, and you were very disappointed at what happened to you and your friend.
First off, Lucifer. Lucifer is the first recorded rebel in human history. And of course, he defies God. And I have a sneaky regard for him because of that, because I do admire people who, take on big tasks. And certainly he took it on, and he was banished, etc. for it. So that's why Lucifer is in it, because he's the first recorded rebel in human history. Why Lazarus is in it is a remark made by a journalist. When I lost my job, I was sacked by who is now Sir Bill Morris, what was then just plain old Bill Morris, the General Secretary of the Transport Union, and he sacked me. And when I eventually fought a very long battle, myself and Eugene McGlone, raging over nearly 4 years, the journalist, when I finally got back, said, "It's the greatest comeback since Lazarus." So that's where the idea of the title came from. And of course, you're right. It was a very disappointing period for me, because I had been active in the amalgamated transport most of my life. And I believe in the union. And I remember having a row with somebody from SIP2 who told me I would never get the job as regional secretary, because the 3 first regional secretaries here had all been from a Protestant unionist background, and the big part of our membership is unionist in the north of Ireland, though not exclusively so. We have a large nationalist membership because we were what people would describe as a labourers' union in the 1920s. So therefore, Catholics being at the bottom of the pile tended to join the amalgamated transport, and so I always had a liking for this union because it was radical. It was committed to world peace. It was a union that was not afraid to take its coal off to employers, and I liked that about it. And I always thought it a non-sectarian union, though I knew we had problems with sectarianism. You can't be totally excluded from that kind of thing. But I remember, and this enraged me. One of the guys, it was kind of around the place that I was going to go for the job as regional secretary up here. And one of the guys out of Siptio, I won't name who he was, said to me, Mick, you're an awful idiot, he said, because if your name is Timothy or Pat, you'll never work in the shipyard if you have a name like that. You'll never be the regional secretary of the Transport Union. And I said to him, do you think it's that sectarian? He said, and you don't know that? He said, you're a fool. So I determined that I was going to get the job as regional secretary. By the way, I wanted to get the job anyway, not just because of what he said, because Matty Merrigan, I thought, should have been the regional secretary. I supported him for it, but he didn't get the job. Yeah, that's a long story. Sure. So I determined to go about getting the job, and I went to get the job. Now, the way the job was filled is quite interesting. It wasn't filled by a small committee. You went before 36 members of the executive and you spoke for 25 minutes, and then you were questioned. You were questioned by the General Secretary, the organiser, the Deputy General Secretary, and 3 or 4 of the executive. And then you were ushered out. And they took a vote by show of hands. So it was a big deal. And I campaigned vigorously amongst the executive to get the job. I spoke to all kinds of factions and groups of Trotskyites, groups of workers. I didn't think that somebody handed you a job like that. Nobody was going to put their hand on my shoulder and give me the job. They did put their hand on other people's shoulders and tell them that the job was theirs, but I was determined to overturn that. And I did, by 18 votes to 12. I was the first person to beat Bill Morris, because everybody he wanted as regional secretary up to that, he got his way. He didn't get his way in the case of Ireland because I'd done a good job of organising. And one of the people who made an enormous contribution to that by actually withdrawing was Eugene McGlone. As I say, I never got along with Morris from day one. And I remember it was a Scottish an old communist friend of mine, Frank Waters, who said to me, he said, you be careful with Bill Morris, laddie, he said. He loves Belfast, he said, because he thinks you can get a train to Ireland from it. He's not like you. And I was kind of worried about what that meant, because it's a hugely significant remark. And it's a remark that has a certain resonance in the British trade union movement because of the membership in Belfast, and because of looking at Ireland through the eyes of simply the Belfast membership and not looking at the totality of the trade union movement in Ireland.
But you were able over time. You were suspended. You and Eugene were suspended.
Yes, we were suspended first. I come back from holidays and. I come back from holidays from Lanzarote, and there was a robbery over there. I'd lost my phone, and I wasn't in communication with here the way I would have been normally. So I come back, and I'd done an interview on RTE with Peter Clusky down south, and I drove up to Belfast for a normal meeting, I thought. And Eugene said to me, we're going to be gassed today, so we're going to be sacked. And I said, don't be annoying me. Let me at that. And I looked out the window, I saw Jimmy Ellsby at the meeting, who was recently been promoted in Dublin, but he's no business at the meeting. I saw a woman called Sharon Withers, who was the finance operator in the unit. I thought, what did these come on? So they came up to the meeting. Ray Collins came to the meeting, who I describe in the book. I say he was a very competent bureaucrat who knows everything and believes nothing. Just one of these people. There are such people in the trade union movement. I didn't like him. Anyway, he said to me, I have a letter from you, from the General Secretary, and I want you to leave this meeting here. I'll give it to you inside in your office. And I said, no, I'll do it afterwards. No, he said, you must come now. So anyway, he said, you better read that letter. And then he proceeded. He told me he didn't know what was in it, and then he proceeded to tell me what was in it, as I was, because I could hardly read it. I was very shaken by what happened. And anyway, the letter said that things have come to my attention, which taken on their own might not mean anything, but taken together, all together, they may lead to a situation. So, to avoid any difficulties, you're on, this is the very important word, a precautionary suspension, right? Leave the office. You can have your car, you can have your mobile, and don't communicate with any person or thing that the union communicates with. And don't talk to anybody about this issue. And if we find something, we'll let you know. And he said, you have to leave the office now. Now that is classically, and I don't want to be bad to America, but that's classically the way you're sacked in a big corporation in America. You know, you're just shown the door and you're walked out by the security guard. And that was actually the way it happened, you know. And Eugene, and this is, and I think I say this in the book, I was delighted when, and this is a terrible thing to say, but the truth, I was delighted when Eugene was with me, because I felt so lonely on my own.
Yes.
And there's no point pretending otherwise. I was happy. That I wasn't happy that he was done in as I was. But he was in a worse situation than me, because the case against Eugene was unbelievable. The case against Eugene was, if you knew what he was doing, you should have told us. And if you didn't know, you were incompetent for not knowing. So whatever way you jumped, he was gone. And there was a terrible, terrible case. To be honest, when you look at the content of it, and it's all up on a kind of a website, you can read it if anybody has the time. Actually, if you're doing a PhD or an MA, it's a great way to study Irish law as it reacts to British circumstances. I think it's quite interesting. But anyway, the point of the exercise was we were out of the organisation, and therein began a war which lasted 4 years. Yes. And I got fantastic support from the rank and file in the union. Absolutely, I would not have. And the officers of the union. Now, just let me say this to the audience. The officers of a union, just imagine what they are. They're like the priests in the Catholic Church. They have the teaching. They run the organisation, and they are paid by the organisation, so they don't attack it. They voted to go on strike. The first time in the history of Transport Union, nearly there 100 years, the officers voted to go on strike. They didn't go on strike, but they voted to go on strike, to take industrial action, right? They supported me. And one of my representative there was a man called Kevin McCurry, who may be known in this parish for other things. Yes. But Kevin represented me over that because he was a member of the union and a good friend down through the years, and done a terrific job. So it was a roller coaster of a battle that raged. And in the end, we were completely exonerated, reinstated. We got our full positions back. We got all our pay back. We got everything back. But it didn't fall from the sky. Yeah. It had to be organised. And it was a long, difficult, torturous struggle. And I have to say this. In that struggle, I had to examine me. Did I waste my life in this belief system which turned on me? And I remember, I don't know whether he says it, you do it twice or three times, but I remember Desmond Graves saying of James Connolly, he said, well, you commit yourself to an ideal when you're young and idealistic, and probably twice again when you have experiences under your belt. And I made the judgment that I would stay and fight no matter what happened, and I would not accept money. And that I was going to do everything I could to get back. And if I didn't get back, I was going to set up an alternative trade union. Now that's easier said than done, but I was going to try it anyway. And I made that clear to everybody that was around. And well, the outcome was a good outcome.
A good outcome for you, but a very, very difficult time And also, I think a time whenever you got great strength from Mary.
Absolutely. I mean,
and your family.
At a time like that, your family is absolutely important. Because remember, and Jane Kerrigan deals with it.
Yeah.
Remember what was said on RTE News on the morning, or there was an audit taking place, and the question was asked: is that into money? Now, this is in a culture of Bertie Ahern and brown paper bags and money all over the slushing all over the place, and everybody is corrupt and all the rest of it. And Jane Kerrigan says, I shrugged my shoulders and said, one of the good guys is being tempted.
Yeah.
Right? And therefore, taking your name is a shocking thing.
Yes.
And they took my name. And I was very angry over that. Sure. But people who know me know me.
Yeah, we started.
And my family knew me.
Yes.
Right? And they never had any doubts. And I had to explain it to me children and
but
other friends outside the trade union. I said, this is, you know, fly shite that they're talking about. And anyway, it was a very difficult period.
A very difficult period, and it was a period where you had the support of some very senior figures in the movement, but also it was like a coming home for you in terms of your family, because you were able to spend more time with them, and that solidarity.
Well, they might say to you, I spent all my time on the phone. But no, that's true. Yeah. That's true. And you kind of, you learn, I suppose, what's important, people who stand with you and all of that. And we were lucky to win. It wasn't inevitable that we would win. Sure. It wasn't inevitable. It was made by the decisions of people. Mm-hmm. And I remember, because sometimes even a majority, we would be watching who would catch the train, who might miss, because the majorities were that sharp in the union. Mm-hmm. Morris was winning some of the votes by the casting vote of the chairman. So therefore, if somebody got the flu on the wrong side, it was and it's, you know, Winston Churchill's famous phrase, thus the hinge of history, things swivel on them. Yes. And, you know, small things happen.
Sure.
That change big things. You learn that.
Yeah. I was struck by this by this sentence close to the end of the book, and I think it's maybe a sentence that you could comment on just as we come to the end of the interview. And just before, I would like to say that this is fascinating read, a real insight into the trade unionism, and also. You bring back a time in history which is long since gone, as I said earlier. And
we're that old.
and it would be good for people, historians or trade unionists, or just people generally interested in history and current affairs to read the book. But the quote I would like you to talk to is this: the left has great potential, but really has to go back to the old ideas and apply them to the new circumstances. What do you mean by that?
What I mean by that is this: the original idea of the left, for want of a better term, going back to the French Revolution, the original idea of the left was that democracy would be the cure for the difficulties of mankind. That rational argument and rational forms of organisation would, as it were, create a better world. So democracy is the key thing that we have to use. Now, the big corporations in this world and those who run the finances of the world, they don't run them, they own them. But the people who understand them are the people who work for them. You know, the people who work in banks and, you know, make all kinds of models that can tell you the answer to 1,000,001 questions. So it is the purpose that these things are put to, not the technology. It's the purpose that these things are put to. And what I want to say is, you know, we want a world where the most important thing is not profit, but the quality of our lives. And, you know, We're facing an ecological crisis. We're facing a political crisis, financial crisis, a housing crisis in the south. And you know, one of the things I spoke about was my involvement in housing in the in the 70s, the Dublin Housing Action Committee. And that's when those people got out and occupied loads of houses that were going to be knocked down. People should have a look at how feasible that is today. I don't tell people what to do, but they should really have a look at that, because I say to homeless people when they say something has to be done, I say have a look. If there's a house there, look at the idea of occupying it. And by the way, it's our job to support you, but we can't. I'm not homeless. You're homeless. You have to decide what you do about it, and that's a big part of the board. But the point I want to make is, the left has got to understand that the big problem of the Soviet Union and all that went with it was the lack of liberty, right? We have to embrace that concept, and we have to examine what our mistakes were and say what they were honestly to people and tell them, not to try and butter over it. And that doesn't mean we abandon the great achievements that were there, or we don't talk them up, or we ever apologise for the defeat of fascism and what the Soviet Union done for the whole world, for humanity, right? And we have this world to win. And I think that if we go back to the original ideas of freedom, it starts in factories, it starts in workplaces, and the most important thing the left can do for people today is to give them some level of self-confidence, because self-confidence is everything. Teaching people, what ideas we'll have, and the clash of ideas, and the argument of ideas, and bringing ideas into the ordinary folks, so that we make the complexity of these ideas of socialism the common sense of the next coming period. Because socialism is about common sense. Some of the greatest thinkers on this earth have been socialists: George Bernard Shaw, Albert Einstein, Sean O'Casey, Bertolt Brecht, Arthur Miller, you name it. Who hasn't been a socialist? We need to capture all that again for the younger generation of people. I speak to people now and I tell them about Bernard Shaw and Sean O'Casey and this and that, and they look at me and say, who are these people? When I was a kid, everybody in Dublin could quote Bernard Shaw. Everybody knew who he was. Everybody talked about him. And he is a fantastic story to give us, because the one thing Bernard Shaw detested above everything else was poverty. He never lived in real poverty himself, but he lived in a kind of genteel poverty, and he hated poverty, loved children. And these things we need to disseminate to people. The socialist message and the Republican message, because I say jokingly in the book, I was a Republican socialist in Dublin and a socialist Republican in Belfast. Because in Belfast, let's be clear about this. In Belfast in the 1950s, you could come up and celebrate May Day. In Dublin in the 1950s, because of the reactionary elements in the church and all the rest of it, it was very difficult to celebrate May Day. So sometimes these two cities have played different roles in our history, right? And we should acknowledge that. Not say one is better than the other or any of that kind of thing, because we've made mistakes in the kind of republic we've tried to create, the counter-revolution, as I call it. We've made mistakes in the way we've done things in the republic. And we should be honest about that when we talk to our unionist friends and tell them we have made mistakes, right? And there's no difficult. We're not going to create a society where we're not going to make mistakes, whether the unionists are with us or not. We're going to make mistakes. The only thing is, have you got the capacity to learn from them? And democracy is a process. It's a process where you can get over your mistakes, find out what they are, try and repair them, and do it in a relatively civilised way. And I think that's the goal for the left of the future.
Yes. And, well, let me just conclude by thanking you. Go raibh míle maith agah faoi Lord Shaw, August G. Spirat and Ternuna. Thank you very much.
Thank you indeed
for your wonderful book, the conversation we've had today, and for taking part in Féile 2021.
My pleasure.